Hi, this is tpe5 Assessing Student Learning. So for this artifact, I chose a copy of a student IEP, and you're probably wondering why exactly this particular IEP. So a little background on this particular case. This was the first ever IEP that I wrote as an intern for this school year. And it happened to also be a triennial, an annual, a manifestation determination, and it was a behavior intervention plan all in one. So this was the first ever IEP I wrote. I look back and I see some mistakes, but I do give myself a lot of credit because this was a lot to unpack for my very first case as an intern for this school year. So with that being said, I did rely on a lot of the IEP team members to really assist me in, looking over results, kind of interpreting what they meant. I would, definitely I relied on the school psychologist to sort of help me to interpret her assessment test. I've never seen, any of these assessments before. The school psychologist that they've done. So I did ask a lot of explanation. I was in constant communication with our school psychologist. I was in constant communication with the other special education teachers, getting their feedback, looking at work samples, looking at various data that they had, any assessments that they had. So this particular student did bring a weapon on campus, and we were determining as an IEP team if this was a direct manifestation of the student's disability and looking at different factors. So with this IEP, like I said, I did rely on really communicating with the rest of IEP team and looking at data, looking at what assessment data I had to create goals, because this particular student did have excessive attendance, but I was able to, before the suspension occurred, I was able to work with the student. So I was able to create goals based on the data that I had, work samples that I've had, and assessments that I, conducted along with, other specialists on the IEP team. With that being said, I was able to look at all of my different data and determine like where would be the most appropriate setting for the student, the least restrictive environment. If currently the student was in a special day class setting, the SDC classes, and the majority of this student's classes were in the SDC setting. So the core classes were all in that setting, if that would continue being the most appropriate. And then again, reflecting back and making sure that I was following protocol for this kind of meeting, because it's not a typical IEP meeting where, annual, you just run through what you need to discuss. You include other specialists like a school psychologist. This, like I said, I had to rely on a lot of the IEP team members to really assist me with this. This particular student had a social, like a counselor, not a social worker, we call them ERMs, so emotional related mental health services. So a counselor to also assist me in that aspect of the student's mental health. So the student would receive counseling and, help me as far as, tracking some of previous goals he had in that realm. So it was a really large IEP team. I really, tried my best to write this to the best of my ability, this IEP. And I mean, I look back and I see some mistakes as I'm looking at this IEP, but I do, like I mentioned, give myself a lot of credit because this was a really tough case to start off the school year. This wasn't the only manifestation determination case I had. I also had another case alongside with this one that was occurring simultaneously. So the beginning of the semester, I've had, quite a ride as an intern. So like I said, this was definitely a case that I look back on, and I am so tremendously proud of myself. And I hope that you can see, the effort that I put in as an intern and why I continue to pursue this. Sorry, I had to pause it really quick, but why I continue pursuing this field. So as I wrap up this video, I did want to highlight some of the elements that this TPE reflected upon. So a few of the universal elements that this TPE really touched base on was Universal 5.5, use assessment information in a timely manner to assist students and families in understanding student progress and meeting learning goals. So during this meeting, like I said, it was a really tough case. I did make it very understandable for the parent because this particular parent has been through IEP since their child was, I believe, in kindergarten or very, very young. So she did appreciate that I was able to break it down to her, each and every goal. I know sometimes we get carried away as educators and write very, very fancy goals, but at the end of the day, like a lot of that jargon, our parents don't understand. So I do my best to break down everything for parents so that they understand, and my student, that what exactly I'm expecting of them, what these goals are in place for. They're in place so that we make sure that they're able to meet certain criteria, they're able to hit certain milestones so that they can be successful during their stay here at high school. And then the next one is Universal 5.6, work with specialists to interpret assessment results for formative and summative assessments to distinguish between students whose first language is English, English learners, standard English learners, and students with language or other disabilities. So like I mentioned, quite often, I worked with the school psychologist, I worked with our ERMS counselor, and seeing what their assessment data looked like, how to interpret it, what did that mean as far as, this was a case that took academics, mental health, behavior, and it was just a little bit of everything that I had to really examine when I wrote my own goals and what was in the best interest of this student. So that was another universal element that I focused on. In the last universal element was using assessment data, including information from students' IEP, IFSP, ITP, and 504 plans to establish learning goals and to plan, differentiate, and make accommodations and or modify instruction. So as I was writing his IEP and I was getting my data and gathering everything that I needed to write his goals, I also was making accommodations that I felt were appropriate for my student. And then during the IEP meeting, we also made sure that parent agreed, parents saw that these were in the best interest, and they were, the parent was able to add what they felt was appropriate as well. And it's just really making this a conversation with parents. I've had, as a parent with a special needs child myself, sometimes these IEP meetings can seem intimidating when you're on the other end, when you're a parent and you see all these specialists discussing some of the areas that your child has a deficit or is in need or is struggling. And sometimes it's hard to take in. So I always keep that in the back of my mind when I am talking to parents, and make it as understandable as possible and make sure that they always feel included in these IEP meetings, because I also am in their shoes when I go to my own son's IEP meetings. So these were the universal elements that this particular artifact did focus in on. But in the mild moderate elements, I did focus on 5.1, applying knowledge of the purposes, characteristics, and appropriate use of different types of assessment used to determine special education eligibility, progress monitoring, placement in the LRE, and services. Candidates also apply knowledge of when, how to use assessment resources that integrate alternative statewide assessments, formative assessments, and other formal, informal assessments results as appropriate based on students' needs. So again, I chose this IEP because it really did focus in on how we monitor the students' previous goals, their placement in the least restrictive environment. We continued, so we did our offer of fate for this particular student was to continue receiving services in the current setting that the student was in the special day classes, to continue receiving mental health services with our ERMS counselor, and his service minutes stood the same. This particular student didn't have speech therapy, so that wasn't an option. So again, it's just looking at all the different data, looking at what I have from my assessments, and making sure that I understand where, and it's not just my decision, it's a whole collective team decision, but obviously I give my input as well when we're coming together as a team. And then looking at some of his statewide assessments from previous IEPs and seeing, how he scored. This one was a little, it's been, I will say it's been very unique as far as statewide assessments, because with COVID, there was a year that we didn't have, the statewide assessment data. So some students did have that data readily available, others didn't. But again, just really looking at what my student needs based on all the different data that I've gathered. And then the mild moderate 5.3, demonstrating knowledge of special education law, including the administration and documentation of assessments and how to hold IEP meetings according to the guidelines established by law. So again, this IEP was unlike an IEP I've had the rest of the semester. Actually, scratch, I've had other IEP meetings that have been out of the ordinary, but this particular IEP, I made sure that I was constantly looking at the deadlines, because one of the deadlines for the manifestation determination is holding the IEP meeting 10 days from the expulsion date, making sure that I kept in guidelines, and that the rest of the team, we knew to meet that guideline, making sure that I invited the correct people. So in my particular site, I have to schedule the IEP meetings. We don't have a secretary or other personnel that schedules them. As a case carrier, you're responsible for scheduling the IEP meeting. So I schedule and include all parties to the IEP meeting. I make sure everybody understands their role, that there's a facilitator, there's a note taker, and there's someone that's editing at the same time. So we have, 3 different people. One is running the meeting as a facilitator. Another person should be taking notes, and another person will pull up. We use Web IEP for this site in this district. So another person making those correct changes as needed. If there's any kind of errors, making sure that we have that in place, as we're going through the IEP. Again, no IEP is ever perfect, is what I've come to realize. And that's why you have to make, necessary edits as you go along in the IEP meeting. And again, making sure that my parents have their copy of their parent rights, that they are notified with enough time to make the meeting, that I'm issuing them their meeting notice. And that, I frequently ask them questions if they understand, break things down to them as, a regular day language, that it's not just IEP, special education jargon that they don't understand. And, making sure that they understand what the meeting is about, having an agenda of what I'm going to discuss, going through each and everything, saying what I'm going to discuss, if I'm discussing present levels, if I'm discussing, progress on previous goals, if I'm discussing proposed goals, I will say, okay, now I'm going to be discussing proposed goals, instead of just jumping into things, because it can get very long and complicated if you don't say what you're going to be discussing. So I make sure to be very clear and concise when I'm running these meetings, so that whoever is in the IEP meeting knows exactly what I'm discussing next. And making sure that, I stay within time limits as well, respecting everyone's time, making sure that I'm not going over time, and that I'm, and also going over meeting norms, making sure that everybody feels respected, that, if somebody's talking and nobody else is talking over them, just the protocol of an IEP meeting so that it runs, smoothly, and that we don't have any kind of miscommunication. Like I said, constantly staying in communication with parents, letting them know what the next steps are, because I don't ever want a parent on my caseload to feel like they're in the dark, or any surprises, because I know as a parent myself, I don't like that. I don't like surprises. I like knowing what to expect, and parents do appreciate that. They appreciate constant communication. So those were the universal elements and the mild moderate elements that I use for this particular artifact.